guys, Rachel here from Unravel Designs and Yarn. And I know many of us are stuck inside our houses right now because there's a pandemic going on, and I thought I would show you guys how I knit a hat from start to finish. Super basic pattern. I'm just using worsted weight yarn, mostly just leftovers from my stash, and I have a pattern that you can get if you click the link up at the top of your screen right now. Super basic though, and I'm just making it a little bit more interesting by adding some contrast colors for the ribbing and a contrast color beanie because colors make things more fun. So yeah, let's get started by showing you what materials you're gonna need for this project. I've got my little bag of fun here. So I've decided that I'm going to do sort of this teal green for the contrast ribbing. I have my needle all ready to go here. This is a 16-inch circular cord, and I've got a size 5 needle on it for the contrast ribbing. This yarn is Madeline Tosh Vintage. It's a really great worsted weight yarn. They come in beautiful colors, as you can see here. I've got this skein, which is like a speckled color that coordinates with my contrast color for the ribbing. And they're super pretty. They are great yarns for knitting a nice soft and warm winter hat. And it is worsted weight. This is Madeline Tosh Vintage. So this is a half skein left over from a project. Well, not even half, probably like quarter or a third of a skein. And then this is a full skein. And then I've stuck inside the middle here the needles that I'm gonna use for the body, which is a size 7. For a hat, you always like to have a smaller needle for the rib and a bigger needle for the body. Well, for the most part, depending on what your stitches are, but this is a basic hat. So smaller needle for the ribbing, bigger needle for the body. So those are the two yarns I'm gonna be knitting primarily with. And then I also have a couple other contrast colors here. I might use them for the pom-pom, or I'm not really sure. I just got them out and I thought I'd show them to you. If anybody has opinions on what color pom-pom I should make, let me know. Or maybe I'll just do all the colors. That would be great too. I can swap them out to match my outfit. And then finally, I always have a really great little toolbox with me. This has all my notions in it. I've got a stitch marker all ready to go that's gonna fit these needles because I'm gonna need that to mark the beginning of my round, and then various other things in here that I might need as we go along. So that is all set. And then of course, I'm gonna package it all up in my bag here. And I do love a bag that matches my knitting, so that I thought would be perfect for this project. All right, I am going to grab a cup of coffee and then we will cast on from the beginning of the project and knit all the way through to the end. So yeah, if you've ever wanted to see a hat knit from beginning to end, here we go. All right, so we are heading into the longest section of this video. And while I keep knitting around and around on the hat body, please enjoy an episode of the Historical Yarns podcast. You can click the link below to check out the entire season if you like it. Welcome to the Historical Yarns podcast, the show where we talk about knitting from the past and bring it into the present. Welcome to episode 1 of season 1 of the Historical Yarns podcast. I'm Rachel Roden.
And I'm Heather Boyd, and this is the history of Shetland lace, part 1.
If you're new to the podcast, here's a bit of background on how we organized it. Every episode will be made up of 2 segments, one where we discuss the knitting traditions, history, and techniques, and then a second where we talk about the Zetland Knit Along, which is a Shetland-style shawl that I designed to go with the podcast. And if you need to get your hands on that pattern, just head over to Ravelry and you can download it there.
We wanted to start out with some information about the geography and sort of the area of the world that we're working with here.
Yeah, because these areas that we're going to be talking about, they're near each other, but far enough away that they have developed some really interesting techniques and things. And so we thought it'd be important to give you the location so that you could have some context for where these places are. So the Shetland Islands, they are part of Scotland, of course. They are about 50 miles northeast of Scotland, and they are made up of about 100 islands. I think a few more than 100 up in the North Sea, I believe it is. It's practically Arctic up there, I think.
Yeah. And do you fly out to the islands or take a boat? How do you get out there?
I think you can do it both ways. It sounds like horrible either way, right? It must be so hard.
Yeah, like, how do you actually get there?
I think they have ferries because when my husband and I were in Scotland a couple years ago, I was really wanting to get out to one of the cool islands out there, you know? I mean, any of them really, because they're all so beautiful and just amazing. But the ferries, they're very specific schedule and even times of year because the water is so rough.
Yeah,
so I think that's the only way to get out there. I'm sure you could do like a private plane or something like that too, but ferries is the main way.
That's probably something that helped them develop their tradition, right? They're pretty isolated.
Yes, they are.
There's not much to do except for hand crafts. That's terrible. That reduces it too much, but really, but yeah, when you have an isolated geographical area like that, you can talk more about this as the archaeologist, but you tend to have a more specific type of culture going on, with less blending in from surrounding areas.
Yeah, they get like really good at certain things, right? Yeah. And Shetland, their thing just became this lace knitting. So like we said, there's about 100 islands out there, but really only 16 of them are populated. And that total population is like 23,000. So it's pretty small, really, for such a large grouping of islands. And then just a little bit of geography information. It's a pretty rugged coastline. They've got lots of low rolling hills, but it is really, really cold, like subarctic kind of climate. So obviously it makes sense that they would have developed ways to keep themselves warm.
And I bet the sheep like it, right?
Yeah.
They grow really nice wool.
They do. Yeah.
In that climate.
Yep. Okay. So jumping into like the early development of the craft, I guess you could say. The earliest samples that we found date to around 1830-ish, but those samples are not, they're pretty fine samples. They're definitely not basic. So you can assume that they were developed even earlier than that. And then we just don't have any evidence of it earlier, but it's pretty cool that that's when they started really like honing their craft. So
probably they were doing it from time immemorial, but really around that time they started to refine it because they were getting word of popularity of different imported shawls and pashminas from India and Kashmir. And in the late 1800s, Empress Josephine and Queen Victoria helped popularize the different shawls and the technique of Shetland knitting because they really took a liking to them and they wore them and they even gave them as gifts to visiting dignitaries of state. I think I even read somewhere that Harriet Tubman received one when she met Queen Victoria.
Oh, how cool is that?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was one way, I guess, that the tradition ended up spreading all around the world.
Yeah.
famous person.
I know. It's really cool. They like figured out almost a way to get some marketing by getting the shawls out into the upper classes of society, the queen even, and all of a sudden everybody wanted a shawl like that. So it's really neat how they managed to get their craft out there like that. And from what I was reading too, the imported shawls and stuff from India, Kashmir, Persia, places like that, a lot of them had designs on them, like the ferns and stuff like that. And that's where some of the Shetland stitches came into play, which we'll talk about more in the next episode. But you can really see how they were inspired almost to the point of copying some of the designs that they were seeing in these imported shawls. What I also thought was really interesting was that shawls weren't really a thing until the 1800s. Like before the 1800s, women didn't really wear anything that could be really called a shawl. I mean, they kind of did, especially in places where it was really cold, like, Scotland, of course. But the upper class, places in England and stuff like that, they just weren't really wearing shawls like that. But then that style of dress that was really light and flimsy and flowy in the early 1800s, they just needed something over their shoulders to keep themselves warm, which is where the shawl really started coming into play. So I thought that bit of like fashion history was really, really interesting.
Yeah, that is actually, when you consider, like, I guess necklines were kind of going down around the same time.
Yeah, they'll come back up with Victoria, but
but during Regency era, they went down for a little while.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh man.
Well, anyway, so it was very much a family-oriented craft, and the women in the family would hone their skills. And then by the mid to late 1800s, many were making a living selling these fine shawls to the upper class ladies. So they were really, it was really booming at that point by the late 1800s.
Sort of like cottage industry.
Yeah, definitely cottage industry. In the early 20th century, when the First and Second World Wars were going on, a lot of factories were used for making things for the war. So the fine knitted lace stuff that people could have bought from a factory before wasn't really available. And that's where the ladies on Shetland really stepped it up, because women still wanted their fine, pretty, lacy things. So, and they couldn't get them as easily, so they had to buy them from an actual hand knitter, which I thought was really cool.
Well, a certain class of lady that could actually afford it, right?
True. Very true. Yeah. We're still talking about like upper class ladies for sure.
Yeah. But they're so light and frothy, it doesn't seem like they would be warm enough for.
Yeah. From what I was reading, HAP. So HAP is what the ladies on Shetland would call the shawls that they would wear. And they were heavier and more rustic and unbleached or undyed or whatever. It was just like the natural fibers, and those were much heavier and hard wearing. So that's what they were wearing.
And with less lace, probably.
Yeah, I think it was mostly
holes.
Yeah, a lot less holes. Maybe something lacy around the edges, but that was pretty much it. So, they weren't wearing those gossamer shawls themselves.
Yeah.
They're what
I
for?
can understand that. Well, living in Nevada, I mean, I've definitely knitted. I remember knitting that Eleanor cowl from Knitty. And it's full of lace. And the first time I put it on and went out in the cold, I was like, this is useless.
It's doing nothing.
As soon as the wind blew, this Nevada wind, which it gets very strong here. It blew right through all the holes of that lace. And I was like, I'm going to send this to a friend in North Carolina.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I imagine it was the same thing for them too. You got to go, I don't know, get some chicken eggs in the morning or whatever. You're not gonna, you need a nice heavy shawl before you walk out that door.
Oh my goodness.
Oh my gosh. All right. So let's talk about the sheep breeds a little bit. Shetland sheep are, of course, adapted to live in the cold, windy islands. The coat itself is very thick with a long staple, so that makes it really strong. And they could spin it really thin because you need a nice long staple length. And by staple, I mean the length of the fiber when they shear the sheep, in case anybody doesn't know what that means. So the staple length is nice and long, which makes it really stable for spinning into super thin yarn. What I found really interesting about that actually is that a lot of the traditional yarn was single ply, which people often shy away from single ply yarn these days because it can fall apart a little bit, especially if you have to rip it out a couple times on your project. Like, it's just not always the most hard wearing of yarns, but I don't know. I'm getting the impression that these ladies were pretty expert at it. So I'm guessing they weren't doing too much ripping out, and they could knit with whatever they wanted.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I mean, single ply tends to stick to itself a little bit more, but maybe that's an advantage rather than a disadvantage when you're coming to knit lace anyway.
Yeah.
With this type of stuff. So.
Yep. And of course they were primarily using hand spun yarn because, that's what they had up there. They weren't sourcing it from mills or anything like that. They spun it all themselves. That whole sheep to shawl thing that has been kind of popular in recent years, they were the original sheep to shawl people back then. They started that movement.
That's amazing. And what about colors?
Oh, color. So from what I was reading, they would knit the shawls in whatever color the fiber was, whatever it was, naturally.
So they didn't do a whole lot of dyeing.
Not before knitting. So that's what's really interesting about this stuff is that they didn't do any dyeing before they knit with it. So it was usually brown or taupe or cream or whatever. But then after they were done, they would bleach it to get it super white because that's what the upper class ladies wanted. They wanted their super white, creamy, frothy shawls, So they would bleach it to get that color. And then they would also dye them black sometimes for anybody who wanted a morning shawl. And then they would also dye them red because apparently red was the color that you wore for weddings. Yeah, I didn't know that red was like the color for weddings, especially after that Game of Thrones episode. I can't think of red in weddings without thinking of that episode.
Oh my gosh.
I know, keep red away from weddings now, but
I think of it as a color that signifies luck in Asian nations.
Oh, it does too.
But not in Scotland. I didn't know that.
I know that was. We'll definitely put our sources in the show notes so that you guys can see where we got our information from. But yeah, that's what I was reading is that they would dye it red. Now, of course, it would be like a rusty red because they're using all natural dyes, whatever they could find to get the color. So
probably madder or
something like that. So anyway, I thought that was really cool.
Fantastic.
As far as what they would actually be knitting with, it was straight needles, of course. Circular needles are a invention of, the 20th century. So they were using straight needles and they called them pins. They were like knitting pins. And they even had that technique where they would tie a waistband. They had like a waistband that they tied around their waist.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. And
with
pin,
a rest. Like a rest for the pin.
Yeah, exactly. You'd stick the pin into the waistband and then it provided like stability that meant you could work just right on the ends of the needles and like go really, really fast with it. So the ones who were super good would do it that way, I guess.
Yeah.
It's cool.
Oh, wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of people who see Shetland shawls now, they do associate them with the really, really fine work, almost like needlepoint, like teeny tiny yarn, very intricate lace, like you've seen them used as baby blankets for the royal babies.
Well, that's where like the wedding ring shawl comes from, right? That is so fascinating. And okay, so I definitely knit a wedding shawl for myself. We don't have to talk about the drama that went on behind that, but like suffice to say, I had a wedding shawl on my wedding day. It was done like 6 hours before I got married, but that's fine.
I think I've seen pictures of it blocking on the floor.
Yeah. But what I didn't know, it's huge, but it definitely couldn't be pulled through my wedding ring because it's knit on bigger needles. It's slightly bigger yarn. I didn't know about the whole idea of the wedding ring shawl, which is, they could often weigh like, up to 2 ounces, usually less than 2 ounces, but they would be like 6 feet square. Yeah. So super giant and light enough and fine enough that they could pull it through, not the man's wedding band, the woman's like tiny little wedding band. So
wasn't that sort of the really test to see like how good of a knitter the woman was?
I think so. Yeah. Or spinner too, right? Because you had to spin the yarn super fine and then you had to knit it super fine too.
Anyone who has ever spun yarn out there, especially you have to consider, not all of these people had spinning wheels. They probably used drop spindles.
Oh my gosh, they probably did.
Yeah. I mean, that's a challenge. Yeah. So it's a real skill.
Yeah, for sure. So anyway, if I could go back and do it over, I would definitely like try to make a wedding ring shawl. Maybe I should try to do it anyway, because why not, right? It'd be super fun. Oh, my husband might kill me if I did another wedding shawl.
Only if it's the day before your wedding.
Oh my God.
Or your vow renewal. Right?
Oh yeah, there we go. Vow renewal. Perfect. All right. Well, that's about everything we wanted to talk about as far as geography, development of the designs and things and the materials. And now we're going to take a quick break and we'll start talking about the first week's clue of the shawl.
right, the hat is finished. It took a couple days for me to get it blocked, and then I went ahead and sewed the pom-pom on. So you can see it's all sewn on here. I got a little bow so I can easily take it off for washing. And that is a complete project. So if you liked watching me knit an entire hat, please give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to my YouTube channel because I'll have more of these coming. Thanks, bye.